cost of living as energy prices rocket. And we're talking about living with COVID too. But first, it's the news with Rosie.
Good afternoon, it's 12 o'clock. I'm Rosie Wright, here to keep you up to date today on GB News. Boris Johnson says Vladimir Putin appears bent on full-scale invasion of Ukraine, and the Prime Minister has vowed to introduce the first barrage of sanctions against Russia. Now, following an emergency Cobra meeting this morning, Boris Johnson says President Putin has completely torn up international law by his actions in Ukraine. The German Chancellor, Olaf Scholz, has halted the approval now of a gas pipeline given the unfolding crisis. Nord Stream 2, which runs between Russia and Germany, was completed last September, but the gas pipeline is not yet operating. Mr Johnson says economic sanctions by the UK will be announced later today.
We expect, I'm afraid, that there is more Russian irrational behaviour to come. And the sad thing is that at every turn in this crisis, the UK's pessimistic predictions have been vindicated. And I'm afraid all the evidence is that President Putin is indeed bent, as you said just now, on a full-scale invasion of Ukraine.
In the last hour, Russia has announced it will recognise some areas currently held by Ukraine as breakaway republics. Stefan Weichert, a journalist in Ukraine, told us he fears the country isn't ready for a war.
They're just not ready. You know, it's a very poor country, Ukraine. And I also, just to add, I also visited a hospital, one of the first hospitals, you know, close to the front line, only 5-6 kilometers from the front line. And they were openly saying, we don't have enough doctors, we don't have enough medicine, and we don't even have like basic supplies to make bandages and stuff.
Of course, we'll keep you up to date today on this developing story. Now, the Queen has cancelled some planned virtual engagements today as she's still suffering from cold-like symptoms due to COVID-19. Well, that's according to a statement from Buckingham Palace. They say Her Majesty's experiencing mild symptoms and will continue with light duties. It is understood that plans over the coming week will be decided nearer the time. Health leaders, charities and unions have all raised concerns over Boris Johnson's Living with COVID plan that was unveiled yesterday. The Prime Minister announced free universal testing for the general public is going to be scrapped in April, but it's not been confirmed if that includes healthcare workers. The NHS Confederation say 94% of health leaders say staff shouldn't be paying for tests. Scotland's First Minister will outline her plan for dealing with coronavirus later today. Nicola Sturgeon's going to speak to MSPs as the Scottish Government's blueprint for managing and recovering from COVID is published. Now, early this month, she'd said Scotland was through the worst of the Omicron wave and the situation was much more positive than at the start of the year. Well, Scottish Conservative Shadow Health and Social Care Secretary, Dr Sandish Gillane, is fully supportive of Johnson's strategy.
Restrictions have to end at some point. We've got to stop what we're doing at some point. It's easy to criticise. It's very easy to criticise. Labour are criticising, SNP are criticising. But what they need to do is have an alternative plan. There's no point saying this is rubbish. What they need to do is say this is what we would do instead and these are the reasons why.
A charity is warning most women don't know the key symptoms of ovarian cancer. It was a poll for Target Ovarian Cancer, and they found the majority of women didn't recognise that bloating, abdominal pain and feeling full could be warning signs. It also found that GPs were too quick to dismiss symptoms. Deputy Chief Executive of the charity, Alex Holden, is calling on the government for more education.
The symptoms are fairly clear. Even in early stages of ovarian cancer, the vast majority of people will experience those symptoms as well. So it would be just to consider it early. So we ask GPs to be thinking about it earlier and also women to be raising it earlier as well. If women were going to GPs and saying, actually, have you thought about ovarian cancer? That would also help.
The fossil of a flying dinosaur known as a pterosaur has been found on the Isle of Skye. The discovery's excited scientists. It reveals that the reptiles grew much larger than they previously thought. Well, experts estimate they lived about 170 million years ago, soaring over lagoons in what was then a subtropical climate. Well, it's believed they caught fish and squid with criss-crossing teeth, apparently perfect for snaring slippery prey. You're now up to date here on GB News. I'll bring you more as it happens. Now let's head to Gloria for the briefing.
Coming up this hour on The Briefing, we'll bring you the very latest on the escalating situation in the Ukraine as Russia's President Putin sends troops in. And what does this mean for us at home? As oil prices surge to a 7-year high, I'll be asking our economics editor, Liam Halligan. Chair of the Education Select Committee, Robert Halfon, will be telling me why he wants a greater focus on vocational education and careers advice in schools. And as all COVID restrictions in England end, I'll be asking Shadow Public Health Minister Andrew Gwynne how we live with COVID while protecting the vulnerable. We'll be live in the House of Commons as the Prime Minister outlines sanctions in response to Russia's moves overnight. Please do subscribe to our YouTube channel. We're edging towards 500,000 followers. Search GB News, or you can find us at youtube.com/GB News online. The situation in the Ukraine is escalating rapidly. Boris Johnson will outline a barrage of sanctions against Russia shortly. Here with the very latest is our security editor, Mark White, and I'm also joined by our economics editor, Liam Halligan, to outline what that might mean for our bills at home. Mark, first of all to you, just bring us up to date with the latest developments, please.
Well, pictures out of that area of eastern Ukraine, quite concerning, obviously, showing those Russian military forces heading towards the border and indeed crossing the border. We're in a period from the political leaders in the US and UK of "I told you so." They said that this is what Vladimir Putin had planned all along, to launch some kind of an invasion. And in fact, they're going beyond that. They're saying that the next move is a full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Now, for their part, the Russians say that's not what their intention is here, that they have moved into these rebel-held areas in a peacekeeping role. These are being held, of course, by pro-Russian separatists, these groups. The cause for concern, I think, is in a statement that's just come out from the Kremlin about a wider recognition of areas within that area of Donetsk and Luhansk, these rebel-held areas around them, that they would recognise as well areas that are currently held by Ukrainian military forces, that they would also be recognised as part of these breakaway republics. Now, if that is the case, that is clearly a potential for conflict going forward, depending on how Ukraine would react to that. So a great deal of concern. And from our point of view, military point of view, we're not there to assist Ukraine directly in any kind of military intervention. It's not part of NATO. We are sending extra troops to NATO countries like Poland and Estonia around there, really to bolster their defences and reassure them. They're understandably worried at this time. But as far as any wider intervention by the UK or the US in Ukraine, that's not going to happen. As I say, it's not a part of NATO, but they've got to be prepared for potentially humanitarian crisis if there is a wider conflict and people spill over the borders into NATO countries.
Liam, the Prime Minister will be addressing the House of Commons at around 12:30, and of course we'll bring viewers that live. He's given an interview this morning saying that we will impose sanctions on Russia, targeting Russian interests as hard as we can. What does that mean practically, and what does that mean for us at home?
Well, Mark's summarised the military and diplomatic situation beautifully, and this is overwhelmingly a military, a diplomatic, a political, a geopolitical story, but there are cost of living implications, and as you know, Gloria, here on GB News we're really focused on the cost of living, helping our viewers beat the squeeze. And so I think it's worth stressing that if we do want to extend our sanctions on Russia, there are already EU, US, UK sanctions on Russia. If we want to extend those sanctions on Russia, yes, they can focus on wealthy Russians living abroad, and yes, they can focus on individual people surrounding Vladimir Putin. But there's also a lot of talk about focusing on Russian trade abroad. Now, Russia provides 40% of Western Europe's gas. Already gas bills are very, very high in this country, as we often discuss. Russia's a major global energy exporter in terms of oil as well. The Russians are the world's biggest wheat exporter. the Russians have just slapped an export ban, little noticed in the West, on something called ammonium nitrate, which is one of the main raw materials for making fertiliser. You know, I live outside of London in a rural area. Farmers are asking me daily what's happening in Russia, Ukraine, because they're seeing fertiliser prices spike up, which are a major part of the cost of food. So, yes, it's a very serious situation. Yes, it's overwhelmingly a military and diplomatic story. But this could have implications on the cost of living for ordinary households across the UK, for ordinary businesses as well, in terms of energy costs. So as they make that very difficult and delicate decision in Washington, in London, in Brussels, whether or not to extend sanctions on Russia, they will have to keep an eye, as Vladimir Putin well knows, on the cost of living crisis here in the UK and elsewhere across the Western world, because if the Russians want to, they could really turn up the heat on us in terms of our ordinary households trying to make ends meet.
And Mark, to you, we've known that Russia's been a danger for years, really, haven't we? I mean, all the way back to the Salisbury poisonings. Have we been doing enough to confront Russia before we get to a stage like we have today?
Well, there's certainly some concern that the focus of the UK in recent years has now been towards an Asia-Pacific tilt. That is undeniably very important to the UK post-Brexit. It wants to secure economic deals with countries in that part of the world, and we know militarily as well. We just saw last year the HMS Queen Elizabeth aircraft carrier and her task force heading off on our first maiden deployment down to the Asia-Pacific. And there has been concern that, you know, the Defence and Security Review has seen a reduction in the number of army units, and real concern that we're taking our eye off the ball as far as Russia is concerned. The British government, for their part, say that's absolutely not the case. We've always had our eye on the ball as far as Russia is concerned, and what we're doing in sort of streamlining, they say, the military is to go towards a much more rapidly deployable force that they can head off in expeditionary terms into conflict zones much more quickly than they could do in the past. So they want to streamline that. They want a more efficient and a better able to react more quickly type of military structure. So they say they've never taken their eye off the ball as far as the threat from Russia is concerned. And clearly now there's renewed focus on that.
Thank you, Mark White. And Liam, you're going to be talking more about this on your show, about what it means for our bills, aren't you?
On the money, 1
On the
PM.
money. Liam will be back at 1 o'clock with On the Money, explaining in more detail how events in Ukraine may affect our finances at home. Now, the Prime Minister will outline sanctions against Russia in the Commons shortly. We will bring you that live, of course. The crisis has already sent crude oil prices to a 7-year high and may make our cost of living crisis even worse. To discuss this, I'm delighted to be joined by Conservative MP Robert Halfon, who co-chairs the Fair Fuel All-Party Parliamentary Group and also is chair of the Education Select Committee. Robert, we'll be discussing your plans for Better Careers advice shortly. But can I first ask you what you hope to hear from the Prime Minister when he stands up in the House of Commons in about 20 minutes' time?
Yes, well, I think that Liam Halligan put it very well. The Ukraine conflict with Russia is not about a faraway country of which we know nothing. This conflict is going to have a huge impact on all of us, particularly in terms of the cost of living. And of course, I want the Prime Minister to set out what the government are going to do in terms of sanctions against Russia. I really support so far the action taken by Prime Minister and the Defence Secretary in terms of sending troops and support both to Ukraine and the neighbouring states like Poland and Estonia. But this is going to impact on energy prices. We're already facing bills of an average of £2,000 a year from April, unaffordable to most families. Oil prices are likely to go up £1.50 per litre, possibly more. if this crisis continues. That is going to affect everyone. It isn't just about motorists, it's about businesses who will face increased costs in transporting their goods. It will impact on the NHS and the police services who depend on vehicles like ambulances or police cars. It's going to impact on food prices because of the cost of transportation. So increased energy and increased fuel are going to feed into inflation and hammer almost every family in the land.
Do to tackle that, surely not put our taxes up in April?
Well, what I've suggested is that I welcome the $9 billion the government are spending on reducing energy bills. They're also giving rebates of up to £150 in terms of council tax. That will be very welcome. The government recently cut the overseas aid budget by £4 billion. I think that needs to be put in a special package to help low earners, perhaps with lower taxes, to help them cut the cost of living as well. They've got to maintain the fuel duty freeze, if not make sure that it's lower. We need a pump watch regulator or monitor as suggested by Fair Fuel UK, because the problem is that, yes, when the oil prices go up internationally, there's a rocket approach in terms of they go up straight away at the pumps, often more than the international oil price reflects. But when the international oil price goes down, surprise, surprise, the rich big oil companies use a feather approach, and these prices come down very slowly and takes weeks to feed into the system. The oil companies are making billions out of motorists, huge profits. I'm a conservative. I've got no problem with companies making profits, but it's got to be fair. And we need a pump watch monitor to make sure that the rise and the fall in oil prices genuinely reflects what the motorist or the businesses, whoever needs to fill up their cars, lorries, vans with petrol and diesel, it should be a fair price that reflects the oil price genuinely, not just the oil companies ripping the motorist off.
I'm sure our viewers will welcome what you've said there. I want to talk about your Education Select Committee, which you are chair of. You're currently having an inquiry into careers guidance at school. You have said careers guidance policy is not fit for purpose in this country. Why do you say that?
My first ever speech in the House of Commons, what's called a maiden speech, was about trying to get schools to do more to encourage pupils to teach about apprenticeships, further education. The problem is we have a system which is based around university, when it should be about skills. All teachers are graduates. I'd like to see teacher degree apprentices, just as we have policing degree apprenticeships or nursing degree apprentices. And we need to, if we really want to build an apprenticeship and skills nation, it starts with careers. We need to have to ensure that children, pupils, students are taught about the value that apprenticeships can offer, about further education colleges, technical schools, and that unfortunately is not happening at the moment. I go around the country visiting schools all the time, and often I meet apprentices as well, and I ask apprentices, were they ever taught in their school about doing an apprenticeship? 8, 9 times out of 10, they say no. I've even met degree apprentices who are doing higher level apprenticeships with really brilliant companies, paid good wages. They've offered to go back to their own school to talk to the students about apprentices. They've been denied that opportunity by the schools, and that's wrong. And I was trying to bring in an amendment yesterday in the skills bill, which is a very good bill about offering every adult a level 3 qualification in the core subjects without any payment, but to try and make an amendment that schools would have more encounters with apprentice organisations, further education colleges, technical colleges, to encourage them to go down that path as well as university.
How do you stop middle-class students being advised to go to university while perhaps working-class pupils are advised to seek an alternative route? And I'll tell you what prompts that. I was a free school meals kid. I had my careers advice when I was at school. No one mentioned university to me. Is there a danger that careers officers could say, you're posh, you're off to uni, you're from an ordinary background, perhaps you should think about an apprenticeship instead?
Well, you've hit the nail on the head, because this is the problem, that sometimes apprentices are seen as lesser things to do, and sometimes we'll say, oh, well, you can go and be a electrician or a plumber. They just think apprentices in those fields. By the way, they are very important fields, and absolutely I would encourage people to do plumbing, electrical apprentices, but you can also do apprentices in law now. You can do them in engineering, manufacturing, nursing, policing, you name it. There are apprentices in every opportunity. And this is only going to change if we transform careers advice, because many parents still believe that universities are the best way forward. We now have degree apprentices. I was recently asked by my old university, ex-university, to make a speech at a degree apprenticeship ceremony. It was a great moment in my life. My old university made a speech in front of hundreds of students who were getting degree apprentices who came from all walks of life. I want everyone to do it. And I want everyone to see that doing an apprenticeship actually is often very prestigious. Also, the important point to make is many graduates now, something like 50% of graduates, are not necessarily getting graduate jobs. People are doing apprenticeships, especially higher levels, are often getting paid more than graduates. And when people realise this and the opportunities that apprenticeships bring, and by the way, apprentices who complete their apprenticeship, 90% of them stay in the company or organisation that has given them that opportunity and get a good job at the end, decently paid. So it's a no-brainer. We just need to get that message out there. That will change through careers advice and those kind of opportunities.
We're always grateful for your thoughts and your time. Thank you, Robert Halfon.
Thank you.
After the break, we'll be speaking to Shadow Public Health Minister Andrew Gwynn about the government's new Living with COVID strategy and what it means for you. First, it's the weather.
Hello again. Bright and breezy sums up the afternoon for most of us. Sunny spells. There are a few showers around. It's breezy, but of course nothing like as windy as recent days. We've actually got a fairly active cold front slipping south. Active means it's got some pretty heavy rain on it. Earlier today brought a very wet start over parts of southern Scotland, northern England and Wales, but it is pushing southwards, and as it is drifting southwards, it's fizzling out. Still bringing some rain for a time across East Anglia and the southeast through the early afternoon, but it is scooting away fairly rapidly. Sunshine follows and a few showers for North Wales, northwest England, and particularly western Scotland, where they're falling as snow over the hills. A scattering of showers coming in on a brisk breeze for Northern Ireland. It is breezy, but it's pretty mild across the south, 11, 12 degrees. Further north, closer to average in single figures. We'll keep the showers coming in across Scotland this evening. Still some snow over the hills. Mostly rain at lower levels. The showers elsewhere easing off, so much of England and Wales having a dry night and a clear night and a bit of a cold one as well. Enough breeze to stop towns and cities dropping to freezing, but certainly rural areas, some pockets of frost possible. We start off with more wet weather then across Scotland, and this weather front is going to be slower to head southwards, so quite a wet day over the Highlands, the rain turning increasingly to snow, but also pushing into the central belt and Northern Ireland, so a soggy afternoon here. For England and Wales, most places dry, just a few showers drifting into South Wales, the Midlands and southwest England. Sunny spells across the east, but it's going to get windy, particularly to the east of the Pennines, northeast England up to eastern Scotland. Very gusty conditions through Wednesday afternoon, and increasingly the winds picking up and bringing more snow showers through Wednesday night across western Scotland and Northern Ireland. So we're quite concerned about this area here, that cold front pushing south, introducing the cold air everywhere, but some snow and strong winds likely in the northwest as we go into Thursday. That's all your weather from me for now. Goodbye.
GB News is the UK's home of discussion and debate
from all perspectives.
To stay up to date on the latest stories,
make sure that you subscribe to the GB News channel
right here on YouTube.
You can watch us live 24/7 across the whole world.
You can also check out exclusive content and catch up on previous episodes of your favourite shows.
Every day, we ask the questions
that you'd ask, so why not add your voice to the conversation in the comments section?
Don't forget to subscribe. We are GB News, Britain's news channel.
Every night at 11 on GB News, we bring you the next day's stories the day before.
Basically like time travel.
If it's a big story, we'll cover it, guaranteed. But we'll also have some fun along the way.
Big opinions, big laughs. Sometimes big hair.
This is
Headliners, the paper review show that won't send you to sleep like the others will.
11 p.m, 7 nights a week. Join us.
Hello there, I'm Eamon Holmes.
And I'm Isabel Webster.
And we hope you can join us for
Breakfast with Eamon
and Isabel.
You make me laugh out loud, belly laugh.
Is that important first thing in the morning?
Yeah, absolutely.
And there's me trying to be deadly serious. News is a serious business.
Yeah, I have to rein you in sometimes.
Well, it doesn't stop us laughing at it. It doesn't stop us having an opinion on what's going on.
Yeah.
And it certainly will not stop us reflecting what you think.
Weekdays from 6 to 9:30 on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton Tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Welcome back. Yesterday, the Prime Minister announced that all COVID-19 restrictions will end in England this Thursday. This means that if people test positive, they don't have a legal requirement to self-isolate. But it has been replaced by advice to stay at home. From the 1st of April, lateral flow tests will also be scaled back, the free ones that we've been using. Joining me now is Andrew Gwynn, Labour MP and Public Health Minister. Andrew, good to see you. The Prime Minister says that lifting the remaining COVID restrictions in England is a source of national pride. He's right, isn't he?
Well, look, I think everybody wants to see the back of COVID, and we want to see the back of COVID restrictions. But the reality is COVID is still very real for a proportion of population. So I would like to see a phased planned removal of the restrictions, because there are too many unanswered questions with the Prime Minister's approach, particularly for those who are clinically vulnerable, clinically extremely vulnerable and immunosuppressed. For them, COVID is still very high risky, and we really do need to think about how we ensure that that section of the population is protected and has the reassurance. I'm really worried that what the government announced yesterday, that only symptomatic people in those groups would have access to free testing. It just seems to me, well, that defeats the object. We need to protect the clinically vulnerable and the immunocompromised from getting symptoms in the first place, because for them it would still be very deadly. So it's things like Gloria that I think haven't been thought through.
How do you do that? How do you protect those with compromised immunity?
Well, I think how you do that is you ensure that they have a good supply of lateral flow tests, so that people who visit them, it's not about testing themselves, that's important, but it's about those who visit them, whether that's care workers or carers or family members. And I speak to people in the immunocompromised community who haven't seen their family members for 2 years. They're desperate to hug grandchildren. They're desperate to see their friends and family. And they can't do that if they haven't got confidence the people that they're meeting are free from COVID. So it's about ensuring that these free tests still are provided, not just for people with those conditions, that they can give them to family members and people caring for them, to give them the assurance that they're clear of COVID as well.
But we are testing too many people at the moment, aren't they? I mean, you'd concede that we need to scale back testing. You can argue about whether the government is scaling back too much, but it is right to scale back on a cost which is higher than the provision of GPs last year.
Well, eventually we will have to roll back on all of these measures. What we would like to see is a phased approach to this. I mean, firstly, there is a cost of living issue here, because, you know, for people who pretty much have to go to work to get the food on their table, if they test positive, they currently have self-isolation regulations. That means they have to stay home and they qualify for a payment. In the future, they won't have that luxury. And many people won't even have the ability to pay for the tests to be able to check whether they should be staying at home. So I do think there are a load of unanswered questions. Yes, we have to scale back at some stage, but I'd like to see a phased approach, probably leading up to the summer, whereby we start to put in place the new level of infrastructure that's needed for fresh waves of coronavirus, so that we learn from how we've dealt with the past 2 years of the pandemic. How are we going to deal with this in the future in a smarter, more sensible and more cost-effective way, particularly looking after those most vulnerable, like the clinically vulnerable and the immunocompromised.
Andrew Gwynne, Shadow Public Health Minister, thank you for giving us your thoughts today. Thank you.
Thank you.
The Prime Minister will be addressing the Commons shortly, but first let's join our political correspondent Tom Harwood, who is at Westminster for us. Tom, what do we expect the Prime Minister to say?
Well, we've heard a little hint of it already, Gloria. The first barrage of sanctions. Pretty emotive language there from the Prime Minister. He'll be spelling out exactly what he means by that first barrage of sanctions against Russia and against those...
Sorry to interrupt you. The Prime Minister is on his feet. We're going live to the House of Commons.
Putin flagrantly violated the Minsk peace agreements by recognising the supposed independence of the so-called People's Republics of Donetsk and Luhansk in eastern Ukraine. In a single inflammatory speech, he denied that Ukraine had any tradition of genuine statehood, claimed that it posed a direct threat to the security of Russia, and hurled numerous other false accusations and aspersions. Soon afterwards, the Kremlin announced that Russian troops would enter the breakaway regions under the guise of peacekeepers. And Russian tanks and armoured personnel carriers have since been spotted. The House should be in no doubt that the deployment of these forces in sovereign Ukrainian territory amounts to a renewed invasion of that country. And by denying Ukraine's legitimacy as a state, and presenting its very existence as a mortal threat to Russia, Putin is establishing the pretext for a full-scale offensive. I think honourable members will struggle to understand or to contemplate how in the year 2022 a national leader might calmly and deliberately plot the destruction of a peaceful neighbour. And yet the evidence of his own words suggests that is exactly what President Putin is doing. When I said on Saturday that his scheme to subvert and invade Ukraine was already in motion before our eyes, the events of the last 24 hours have, sadly, shown this to be true. We must now brace ourselves for the next possible stages of Putin's plan. The violent subversion of areas of eastern Ukraine by Russian operatives and their hirelings, followed by a general offensive by the nearly 200,000 Russian troops gathered on the frontiers at peak readiness to attack. If the worst happens, then a European nation of 44 million men, women and children would become the target of a full-scale war of aggression, waged without a shred of justification for the absurd and even mystical reasons that Putin described last night. Unless the situation changes, the best efforts of the United States, of this country, France, Germany, and other allies to avoid conflict through patient diplomacy may be in vain. From the beginning, we have tried our utmost, we've all tried, to find a peaceful way through this crisis. On the 11th of February, my right honourable friend, the Defence Secretary and the Chief of the Defence Staff, Admiral Radakin, paid the first joint visit to Moscow by the holders of their offices since Churchill, who was also Defence Minister at the time, travelled to Russia with General Alan Brooke in 1944. They held over 3 hours of frank discussions with the Russian Defence Minister, General Shoigu, and the Chief of Staff, General Gerasimov, demonstrating how seriously we take Russia's security concerns, how much we respect her history, and how hard we are prepared to work to ensure peaceful coexistence. My right honourable friend, the Foreign Secretary, delivered the same messages when she met our Russian counterpart in Moscow on the 10th of February. I've spoken on a number of occasions to President Putin since this crisis began. So has President Biden, while President Macron and Chancellor Scholz have both visited Moscow. Together, we have explored every avenue and given Putin every opportunity to pursue his aims by negotiation and diplomacy. And I will tell the House, we will not give up. We will continue to seek a diplomatic solution until the last possible moment. But we have to face the possibility that none of our messages has been heeded and that Putin is implacably determined to go further in subjugating and tormenting Ukraine. And it is because we suspected as much that the UK and our allies repeatedly sounded the alarm about a possible new invasion, and we disclosed much of what we knew about Russia's military build-up. Britain has done everything possible to help Ukraine to prepare for another onslaught, training 22,000 soldiers, supplying 2,000 anti-tank missiles, and providing £100 million for economic reform and energy independence. We will now guarantee up to $500 million of development bank financing. I travelled to Kiev to meet President Zelensky on the 1st of February. I saw him again in Munich the weekend. I spoke to him again last night, soon after President Putin's speech, to assure him, as I'm sure the whole House would agree, was the right thing to do. I assured him of Britain's unwavering support for Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. And now the UK and our allies will begin to impose the sanctions on Russia that we have already prepared, using the new and unprecedented powers granted by this House to sanction Russian individuals and entities of strategic importance to the Kremlin. Today, the UK is sanctioning the following 5 Russian banks: Rossiya, IS Bank, General Bank, Promzyaz Bank, and the Black Sea Bank. And we are sanctioning 3 very high net worth individuals: Gennady Timchenko, Boris Rottenberg, and Igor Rottenberg. Any assets they hold in the UK will be frozen. The individuals concerned will be banned from travelling here. And we will prohibit all UK individuals and entities from having any dealings with them. This is the first tranche, the first barrage of what we are prepared to do. And we hold further sanctions at readiness to be deployed alongside the United States and the European Union if the situation escalates still further. Last night, our diplomats joined an emergency meeting of the UN Security Council, and we will raise the situation in the Organisation for Security and Cooperation in Europe. And let me emphasise what I believe unites every member of this House with equal determination: the resolve of the United Kingdom to defend our NATO allies is absolute and immovable. We've already doubled the size of our deployment in Estonia, where the British Army who ask for nothing except to live in peace and freedom. We will keep faith with them in the critical days that lie ahead. And whatever happens, Mr. Speaker, Britain will not waver in our resolve. And I commend this statement to the House.
Leader of the Opposition, Keir Starmer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yesterday was a dark day in Europe. The Russian president denied the right of a sovereign nation to exist, unilaterally recognising separatist movements that he sponsors and who seek to dismember Ukraine. And then, under the cover of darkness, sent in troops to enforce his will. Putin appears determined to plunge Ukraine into a wider war. We must all stand firm in our support for Ukraine. We support the freedom of her people and their right to determine their own future without the gun of an imperialist held to their head. There can be no excuses for Russia's actions. There is no justification for this aggression. A war in Ukraine will be bloody, it will cost lives, and history will rightly scorn Putin as the aggressor. Putin claims to fear NATO expansion, but Russia faces no conceivable threat from Allied troops or from Ukraine. What he fears is openness and democracy. He knows that given a choice, people will not choose to live under the rule of an erratic and violent authoritarian. So we must remain united and true to our values across this House and with our NATO allies. We must show Putin that we will not be divided. I welcome the sanctions introduced today and the international community's efforts to unite with a collective response. However, we must be prepared to go further. I understand the tactic of holding back sanctions on Putin and his cronies to try to deter an invasion of the rest of Ukraine. But a threshold has already been breached. A sovereign nation has been invaded in a war of aggression based on lies and fabrication. If we do not respond with a full set of sanctions now, Putin will once again take away the message that the benefits of aggression outweigh the costs. So we will work with the Prime Minister and our international allies to ensure that more sanctions are introduced. Russia should be excluded from financial mechanisms like SWIFT, and we should ban trading in Russian sovereign debt. Putin's campaign of misinformation should be tackled. Russia today should be prevented from broadcasting its propaganda around the world. And we should work with our European allies to ensure that Nord Stream 2 pipeline is cancelled. Whatever the sequencing of these sanctions, this won't be easy. Britain must work with our European allies to handle the disruption in the supply of energy and raw materials. We must defend ourselves and our allies against cyber attacks. We must bring together the widest possible coalition of nations to condemn this action against a sovereign UN member state. Ukrainians are defending their own country and democracy in Europe. We must stand ready with more military support for Ukraine to defend itself. And we must stand ready to do more to reassure and reinforce NATO allies in Eastern Europe. But we must also get our own house in order. The Prime Minister said the lesson from Russia's 2014 invasion of Donbass is that you can't just let Vladimir Putin get away with it. But until now we have. We have failed to stop the flow of illicit Russian finance into Britain. A cottage industry does the bidding of those linked to Putin, and Russian money has been allowed to influence our politics. We have to admit that mistakes have been made. We have to rectify them. This must be a turning point, an end to oligarch impunity. We need to draw a line on Companies House providing easy cover for shell companies. We need to ensure our anti-money laundering laws are enforced. We need to crack down on spies. And we have to make sure money isn't pouring into UK politics from abroad. Russian aggression has now torn up the Minsk Protocol and the Budapest Memorial. But even at this late hour, we must pursue diplomatic routes to prevent further conflict. So can the Prime Minister tell us what international diplomatic efforts are going on and what role the UK will have in that process? Mr. Speaker, we know Putin's playbook. He seeks division. We must stay united. He believes the benefits of aggression outweigh the consequences, so we must take a stand. And he believes the West is too corrupted to do the right thing, so we must prove him wrong. I believe we can, and I offer the support of the opposition in that vital endeavour. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, can I thank the right honourable gentleman, the Leader of the Opposition, for the clarity with which he has just spoken and the support that he has given to the UK's strategy in dealing with this crisis in Europe. And I think, if I may say so, that that will be noted, and the change in the approach taken by the opposition is I think, massively, over the last couple of years, Mr. Speaker, is massively beneficial. The change over the last couple of years, Mr. Speaker, which I think that a fair-minded person would acknowledge. And he's raised some important questions, and they relate to the ways in which we clamp down on Russian money in the UK and indeed throughout the West. And this country was the first to publish a register of beneficial ownership. This country has led the way in cracking down on on wealth that is unexplained, and we are bringing forward an economic crime bill to take forward further measures, Mr. Speaker. And I think I should understand it is absolutely vital that we hold in reserve further powerful sanctions, as I think the right honourable gentleman acknowledged, in view of what President Putin may do next. And we want to stop Russian companies from being able to raise funds in sterling or indeed in dollars, Mr. Speaker. We want to stop them raising funds on UK markets, and we want to strip away the veil that conceals the ownership of property in this country and indeed throughout the West. And we will work with our friends and partners around the world to achieve that. And the sanctions we're implementing today are very tough. Promziaz Bank is a top 10 Russian bank, and it services 70% of state contracts signed by the Russian Ministry of Defence. But the measures that we have prepared are much, much tougher still, and we will have absolutely no hesitation in implementing them. Mr. Speaker, we will get on with the business of diplomacy, and he's absolutely right to draw attention to the importance of diplomacy now, in spite of everything that is happening on the borders of Ukraine and now in Donbass. There is a G7 meeting straight after this statement, Mr. Speaker. We will be holding meetings in NATO, in the P5, and in every forum where it is relevant and possible to bring President Putin to understand the gravity of what he is doing. The UK will continue to offer support to our Ukrainian friends, and I do think it has been right for us to be out in front in offering military assistance, defensive military assistance to the Ukrainians. I think that has been the right thing to do. I spoke last night to President Zelensky, who made further requests, and we will consider them. We're doing everything we can to offer support in the time that we have, and we will do that. But I just think it is worth, and I'm glad that the right honourable gentleman seemed to support that as well. It is absolutely vital at this critical moment that President Putin understands that what he is doing is going to be a disaster for Russia. And it is clear from the response of the world to what he has done already in Donbass that he is going to end up with a Russia that is poorer, as a result of the sanctions that the world will implement. A Russia that is more isolated, a Russia that has pariah status, Mr. Speaker. No chance of holding football tournaments in a Russia that invades sovereign countries, Mr. Speaker. And a Russia that is engaged in a bloody and debilitating conflict with a fellow Slav country. What an appalling result for President Putin, Mr. Speaker. I hope that he steps back from the brink and does not conduct a full invasion. But in the meantime, Mr. Speaker, we must implement the tough package that we put forward, and we will continue to offer the Ukrainian people all the support that we can.
Theresa May.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I welcome my right honourable friend's statement and also welcome the UK's unwavering support for Ukrainian sovereignty at this gravest of times, which shows we can never take our eyes off Russia. But does my right honourable friend share my concern that while the focus today is rightly on protecting Ukrainian independence and territorial integrity, what lies behind this is a wider worldwide trend of authoritarian states trying to impose their way of thinking on others, and that the battle in which we must now engage is nothing more nor less than the defence of democracy itself.
My right honourable friend is entirely right, and that is what is at stake. And what happens in Ukraine, what is happening in Ukraine now, is being watched around the world, and the echoes will be heard in Taiwan, in East Asia, and throughout the world.
We now come to the leader of the SNP, Ian Blackford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And can I thank the Prime Minister for advance sight of his statement, and to the National Security Advisor who has briefed opposition leaders. Mr. Speaker, this is a dark day for the people of Ukraine and for people right across our European continent. Europe stands on the brink of war as a consequence of Russian aggression. It is a day that communities across Scotland, right across these islands and indeed across Europe, desperately hoped would never come to pass. But although that sense of darkness defines today, how we now collectively respond will define the days to come. This chamber, especially during recent months, has seen fierce debate and disagreements. But today, I think it's important to say, in the face of Russian aggression against Ukraine, that in this House, that we all stand together. Stand together and stand with our partners across Europe and indeed across the globe. But more importantly, Mr. Speaker, we stand with the Ukrainian people who are now under assault. A European country, an ally, is under attack. We should be very clear about what is now happening. This is an illegal Russian occupation of Ukraine, just as it was in Crimea. Russia has effectively annexed another 2 Ukrainian regions in a blatant breach of international law. This effectively ends the Minsk process. It is a further violation of the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine. No one should even repeat the Russian lie that this is about peacekeeping. Mr. Speaker, this is warmongering, plain and simple. President Putin must hear the call from here and elsewhere to draw back before any further escalation can take place. Mr. Speaker, I and my party welcome the sanctions that are now being brought forward, but it's deeply regrettable that the delay has allowed many Russian individuals to shift dirty assets and money in the last number of weeks. But can I ask the Prime Minister specifically if the Russian state and individuals will immediately be suspended from the SWIFT payment system? And just as economic sanctions against Russia are welcome, Ukraine needs immediate economic and indeed humanitarian support if required. When will economic and humanitarian support be enacted, and what will it entail? Can the Prime Minister also confirm that there will be exemptions for partners of UK citizens residing in the Ukraine to come to the United Kingdom? They need that certainty, and they need it today. In the days ahead, we can no doubt expect a barrage of disinformation from the Russian media and its proxies. So, can the Prime Minister update on how the United Kingdom government intends to combat that threat? This is also the moment to end the complacency in implementing the Security Committee's Russia report. Will the Prime Minister now commit to its full implementation and update the House accordingly? Can I also ask the Prime Minister that after the UN Security Council meeting last night, the brief meeting, when it will next meet, and what coordination is happening across all international organisations to force President Putin to step back from the brink before it is too late? Finally, let President Putin hear loudly and clearly that he must now desist from this act of war, this attack on a sovereign nation. Let us all demonstrate that we stand with the people of Ukraine.
Mr. Speaker, can I wholeheartedly thank the Right Honourable Gentleman for the terms in which he has just spoken, the unity and the resolve that he has just shown in common with the Right Honourable Gentleman, the Leader of the Opposition. I think the spirit that this House is showing today is absolutely invaluable, and he's right to raise questions about the speed in which we've been able to sanction various individuals. We did bring forward the Magnitsky sanctions, as he knows, and he was important in that last year. We are bringing forward the registry of beneficial ownership faster than any other country, stripping away the veil on Russian dirty money. He asked about support for Ukraine. As I mentioned to the House, we've given £100 million worth of support, particularly for Ukraine's energy crisis and also for other economic needs, plus the further $500 million that I announced just now. And, Mr. Speaker, the diplomatic effort is now.
Let's join our political correspondent Tom Harwood now. Tom, sanctions for 5 Russian banks and 3 high net worth individuals. The Labour leader Keir Starmer says not enough in terms of sanctions.
Yes, certainly, and I think that's a call that will find common cause with many on the Tory benches as well. Of course, the Prime Minister was keen to emphasise this is just the first tranche, the first barrage, in quite belligerent language, really, of sanctions against Mr. Putin, his acolytes, and indeed the Russian state. So, yes, I can expect that really this is probably a wise call from Mr. Starmer, because it is likely that more will follow, and Starmer may be able to claim a political victory there. But ultimately, I think the biggest, most seismic element of this statement was not so much in the sanctions, but in the recognition of what has happened. It went further than many European countries. It went to say that this constitutes an invasion. The incursion upon those so-called breakaway parts of sovereign Ukrainian territory by Russian troops is an invasion. That's what the British government has today recognised, and that is a seismic event. Now, the slight nuance here, the slight technicality, is that it is not yet a full-scale invasion, in the words of the British government. It is an invasion, but not yet a full-scale one that would go beyond that region, that would use the full might of the Russian army, over 100,000 troops, the tanks, even making use of those field hospitals that have been built around the Ukrainian border. That could still be to come, and that's why there's this iterative approach to sanctions, some being held back, trying to warn off that further full-scale invasion. A smaller group of sanctions now for the incursion, for the beginning of that invasion, as we have seen, but holding sanctions back in terms of trying to diplomatically warn Russia away from that full-scale invasion. That is the plan of this government.
The leaders of the opposition parties, of course, they had some tweaks and some calls to go further, but it was a united House of Commons that we saw there, and the Prime Minister welcomed their remarks of both Keir Starmer and Ian Blackford, the SNP leader.
He certainly did. There was a common direction of travel. Yes, some differences in the particulars, but ultimately this was a united House of Commons today, and ultimately a Prime Minister who I think spoke with more authority in that chamber than he has done for quite some time. Yes, he mentioned Churchill. Yes, he mentioned diplomacy, things that ultimately, before, when this Prime Minister has mentioned in the House, receive laughs or opposition from the benches opposite. But today, when he mentioned those things in his speech, it was met with solemn silence. It was met with the seriousness and the gravity of the situation. This was a united House trying to project, actually not just to the country, but to the world, the need for united nations in the West and a united West in general when it comes to Russian belligerence, Russian aggression, and indeed Russian invasion. Yes, I think that ultimately the Labour Party and the Prime Minister has acknowledged today that the Labour Party has changed from the position it once held under a former leader. It now seems to be on the side of the West, on the side of NATO, and the House did seem really quite united in its broad mission. This is something that I think the Prime Minister will be to some extent relieved about. He was received as a Prime Minister, as a statesman at that dispatch box this afternoon, and that's something that he has not been seen as in that chamber for quite some time.
Indeed, big politics there. And also the Labour leader called for the end of broadcasting of Russia Today. Just remind us about Russia Today, would you?
Yes, Russia Today being that television channel, that Kremlin-backed television channel that operates within the United Kingdom, that has a licence to operate within the United Kingdom. The Labour leader saying that licence should be revoked. Ultimately, I'm sure there are many on the Tory benches who would agree with that as well. It is a television company that does promote the line of the Kremlin, as is seen by many. So miraculously, this television company that receives funding from the Russian state often aligns itself with the views of the Russian state. Who would have thought? Interestingly, looking at the television company Russia Today, but also the cultural sphere in general, there did seem to be a hint from the Prime Minister from that dispatch box that he does not want to see football tournaments be held in Russia either. So potentially a big cultural package there from the Prime Minister, at least in terms of hints. Of course, not going further in terms of clear policy directions so far. Undoubtedly, these will all be things that are being considered for the next tranche, the next barrage, as this Prime Minister describes it, of sanctions. Although there is legitimate discussion and disagreement to be had now as to why that wider barrage of sanctions has not been deployed right now. This iterative approach is something that clearly has been decided upon by this government, but clearly some think it is not enough soon enough, that there should be heavier sanctions at the front-loading those sanctions, whereas others seem the need to hold them over Russia as this sort of sword of Damocles to prevent further incursions and that full-scale invasion that the West fears so much more than this incursion, this invasion that has currently started in those so-called breakaway regions of Ukrainian sovereign territory.
Tom Howard, our political correspondent, thank you so much for all of that. Thank you. The time is 2 minutes past 1. It is time to get the news with Rosie Wright.
Good afternoon. It's just 2 minutes past 1. I'm Rosie Wright, here to keep you up to date on GB News. The Prime Minister has announced sanctions against 5 Russian banks and 3 very high net wealth individuals. It's the first in what Boris Johnson says will be a barrage of measures against the Kremlin, as he warns Vladimir Putin appears set on overrunning Ukraine. The Prime Minister told MPs that Russia's deployment of troops into parts of eastern Ukraine, which Russia has now recognised as independent states, amounts to a renewed invasion of the country. Boris Johnson has urged the British people to brace themselves for the next stages of President Putin's plan.
If the worst happens, then a European nation of 44 million men, women and children would become the target of a full-scale war of aggression, waged without a shred of justification for the absurd and even mystical reasons that Putin described last night. Unless the situation changes, the best efforts of the United States, of this country, France, Germany and other allies to avoid conflict through patient diplomacy may be in vain.
Well, earlier, Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky says the country may break ties with its neighbour.
I would like to tell you that I've received a request from the Foreign Ministry. I will consider the issue of severing diplomatic relations between Ukraine and the Russian Federation. Immediately after our press conference, I will consider this issue as well as other issues like our steps regarding escalation by the Russian Federation.
Of course, this is a developing story and we'll keep you up to date on everything as it happens here on GB News. Now, in other news, the Queen has cancelled some planned virtual engagements today as she's still suffering from cold-like symptoms due to COVID-19. That's according to a statement from Buckingham Palace. They say Her Majesty is experiencing mild symptoms and will continue with light duties. It's understood plans over the coming week will be decided nearer the time. Scotland's First Minister is going to outline her plan for dealing with coronavirus later today. Nicola Sturgeon will speak to MSPs as the Scottish Government's blueprint for managing and recovering from COVID-19 is published. Early this month, she'd said Scotland was through the worst of the Omicron wave and the situation was much more positive than at the start of the year. Scottish Conservative Shadow Health and Social Care Secretary Dr Shandas Gillane is fully supportive of Boris Johnson's strategy.
Restrictions have to end at some point. We've got to stop what we're doing at some point. It's easy to criticise. It's very easy to criticise. Labour are criticising, the SNP are criticising. But what they need to do is have an alternative plan. There's no point saying this is rubbish. What they need to do is say this is what we would do instead and these are the reasons why.
Well, health leaders, charities and unions have all raised concern over Boris Johnson's Living with COVID plan that you'll remember was unveiled yesterday. The Prime Minister announced that free universal testing for COVID-19 for the general public is going to be scrapped in April, but that's not been confirmed if it includes healthcare workers. The NHS Confederation say 94% of health leaders say staff shouldn't be paying for tests. A charity's warning most women don't know the key symptoms of ovarian cancer. A poll for Target Ovarian Cancer found the majority of women didn't recognise bloating, abdominal pain and feeling full as warning signs. It also found GPs were too quick to dismiss symptoms. Well, Deputy Chief Executive of the charity, Alex Holden, is calling on the government for more education.
The symptoms are fairly clear, even in early stages of ovarian cancer. The vast majority of people will experience those symptoms as well. So it would be just to consider it early. So we ask GPs to be thinking about it earlier and also women to be ready